Hey Jordan, I wanted to let you know we are live on YouTube and eScribe.
Great, thank you. Can you make me a co-host when you have a chance?
Yep, I just did.
Great.
Hey, I wanted to let you guys know I'm going to be switching devices probably halfway through this meeting, or very soon actually, because I'm going to be getting my second COVID shot, but want to hear all of the presentation. So.
Okay, it is 9:45, so I think we can go ahead and get started. I will call the Land Use and Planning Committee to order. Our first item is roll call, and I'm going to go through council members as I see them on the screen. I've got a poverty of screen space today, so looks like Becerra is present. Contos is present. Harp is absent. Hess is present. Jones is present. Merritt is present. Ramos is present. Cheryl is present. Vasika is absent. Van Lossberg is present. West is present. And I think I just missed Anderson, who is absent. We continue to meet virtually and invite folks to join the meeting via Zoom from the city agenda website, ci.missoula.mt.us/webcasts. There's also instructions there to join by phone and other ways to participate in the meeting. We have minutes from March 31st. Are there any changes to those minutes? Seeing none, those will be approved. At this point, is there any public comment on items not listed on the agenda? Seeing none, we can move on to our two regular agenda items. And we'll take them in the order listed on the agenda. Our first item is a resolution to include 903 South First Street West on Missoula's inventory of historic resources. And we have Lavelle Means here. We also have Elizabeth Johnson, our new not open space, pardon me, I was looking at Grant, our new historic preservation officer who started at the city of Missoula a couple of weeks ago. So welcome to Elizabeth. I think Elizabeth, actually, do you want to just say hello and not to put you on the spot, but feel free if you'd like. You're welcome to introduce yourself.
Hey everyone, I'm Elizabeth. It's a pleasure to meet y'all. Just got into Missoula a couple weeks ago, and I'm happy to be here and looking forward to getting to work with some of you a little bit closer.
Great. Thanks so much. Welcome to the city, and we're looking forward to working with you as well. And then Lavelle, are you going to present this item?
Hi, yes, this is Lavelle Means, and I am going to be presenting a PowerPoint slide. I'm doing this through my remote desktop, which doesn't have the camera. So I've called in, give the presentation. That should be visual. And then I'll try to switch over to my regular laptop for other visuals. Sorry for the complication.
That's no trouble. Thanks, Lavelle. I'll note for the record that Stacy Anderson has joined us as well. So Lavelle, go ahead and take it away on the presentation.
Okay. Are you able to see the screen here then?
Yes.
Thank you. And it's also, I just wanted to note that For this particular request, which is a resolution to include this parcel on Missoula's inventory of historic resources, one or possibly two of the property owners will be joining us as well. So this is an action item. We are asking that you consider passing a motion to approve a resolution to place this property on Missoula's inventory of historic resources. Today, I will provide you with a background on what makes up the local inventory, the benefits of being on the local inventory, and the process of being added to the local inventory. Then I'll provide you with background on this particular site and ask you to consider the motion. The property owners for the site area are also here and may wish to speak to the listing. So I'm here today primarily to talk about adding a property to Missoula's inventory of historic resources, which is referred to as the local inventory. There are two ways that properties are considered part of the local inventory. One, as a property individually listed on the National Register of Historic Places. This is a process that involves research and documentation and consideration of several criteria that is compiled and submitted to the State Historic Preservation Office, and then pending their review and support, it is forwarded to the National Register staff at the National Park Service for additional review and consideration before a final decision is made to include a property on the registry. The second process is a local review and approval process for local historic resources. This is a process that we've been elevating in the last few years. It involves much of the same set for research and documentation and consideration of criteria, but garners recognition and some benefits of incentives once the local decision-making body has decided to include it as a part of the local inventory. This provides the local community a say and a way to determine places and properties that are significant to us. So there are many benefits of having these local historic resources. First off, it fosters that civic and neighborhood pride in accomplishments of our past. It instills a sense of identity based on Missoula's history. It assures valuable historic and cultural fabric remain in the community for future generations to come. It recognizes a local desire to preserve, rehabilitate, and to reuse, provides support that is timely and localized. And it supports property owners' wishes through things like incentives that we have worked into our zoning code, including adaptive reuse and the ability to apply for parking reductions. The process for considering a local historic resource includes the property owner submitting an application and conducting research on a particular property. This includes documentation, research, and consideration of criteria. In this case, the property owner came forward originally in conjunction with an adaptive reuse proposal they were pursuing. The Historic Preservation Officer reviewed the material and provided a recommendation to the Historic Preservation Commission. The Commission concurred and considers the property eligible to be added to Missoula's inventory of historic resources. The process doesn't stop at being eligible, though. We are here today to ask your support through a resolution to include it, to technically include it, and designate it on the local inventory. Related, just as a relationship to future use of the property, over time, the property owner has decided not to pursue the adaptive reuse, but to move forward with a project that will be a by right project for vertical mixed use likely, and to consider the local inventory listing for the benefit of qualifying for a parking reduction, which I had mentioned is one of those other incentives. So just to give you a little bit of background about the property, it is the business name for the time of when this was a historically significant use is the Bissinger and Company Hides, Soles, and Fur. The business was formed back in 1880 and soon became one of the largest hide and wool dealers in the West. They had offices all over the West. This particular building warehouse was built around 1900. It was used for fur trading, as a railroad spur use, and shipping. Its current use was manufacturing, and there are some residential properties on the site as well. It is, there are only a few of these early brick commercial warehouses left in Missoula. And what is being proposed eventually would be something with manufacturing, office, and some multifamily. The Bissinger story itself involves a the business manager who by 1919, Paul D. Wilcox, was in charge of the Missoula warehouse. He was an active member of the Missoula Chamber of Commerce, and he lived only a couple blocks away. This area developed as an industrial district combined with the McLaughlin and Company, the Polly's and West Lumber Companies, and the Western Montana Flowering Company. The Bissinger Warehouse is the only remaining historical industrial building in the area. It represents Missoula's brick warehouse vernacular. And I'm showing here also a sales receipt and brochure found in the building, just to give you a little context of the character of the time. The property is between 1st and 2nd Street, just to the west of the Bitterroot Rail. And it is also west of the McCormick Historic District. These are some images of the historic warehouse from top left to bottom right. This shows the 1st Street image along as a front elevation. And then the east overall elevation with a 1950s addition shown on the left. And this is along the Bitterroot Rail line. The east overall elevation, oh, sorry, I did that one already. Next picture is the northeast view, showing a bit of the front and the relationship to the Bitterroot Rail. And then the west elevation showing an aspect of the loading dock as well, and some of the unique and important configuration of the window with the arched cap at the top. For the warehouse itself, you can see the arched masonry exterior windows that are still intact. You can see the Missoula brick, which was painted over, but you can see the coloration behind it. And then there's the interior timber post and beams, as well as an original freight elevator. So all of these things help to tell the story of this building. And there are a series of local designation criteria that is used for and help to guide the application to include it on a local inventory. The first of which is that it needs to be 45 years or older. There's a host of other criteria that really cross over with the kind of criteria used for the review of the local, of the national listing as well, the individually listed as well. The key here is that the structure is definitely old enough. The building represents the Missoula warehouse brick vernacular, and it is deemed eligible. Eligible given the association with events that have made a significant contribution to the broad patterns of our history. We attached a memo that provided this background with much more of the story to your referral, along with the resolution we are asking you to consider. So you can read more about it in that the memo as well. So just to give you a sense of the timeline to this point, there was an application for this parcel being added to the local inventory in March of 2020. The applicant pursued some reuse and addition options from that point up to about March 2021 and through today. There were early discussions with HPC. Besides that, deeming it of being eligible to be on the local inventory that happened back in April of 2020. They also met with the property owner and talked about potential design options in November of 2020 and then again in January of 2021. Today we are here asking you to consider a motion to add this parcel to the local inventory. And then with that motion, it could appear on the City Council consent agenda or committee report for Monday. The applicant would then be able to consider a parking reduction for future use and addition. That is an administrative process where the preservation officer would be working with the current planning staff on determining the appropriateness of a parking reduction, the amount that would be qualifying. And then being with the local inventory, or as I say, the Missoula Inventory of Historic Resources, the applicant is also aware that any work being done on the site that qualifies it through, where it needs to have a zoning compliance permit or a building permit would have to go through a preservation permit process in advance. So the HPC would be considering an HPP application. We don't have one technically in front of us yet, but we are, there's a possibility that we could be looking at that application by June of 2021. So today I'm asking you to consider this motion, which is to approve a resolution to approve 903 South First Street West as a local historic resource to be designated and included on Missoula's inventory of historic resources. And that concludes my presentation.
Great, thanks, Lavelle. On behalf of the applicant, Nick, are you here for this on behalf of the applicant?
No, I'm for the next agenda item.
Lavelle, I'm not seeing the applicant here. Do you know?
We have the property owners are Mike Morgan and Frank Scariano. And okay. I know that Mike was going to have to be a little late. He was going to join us around 10, which it is now. Okay. And I'm not sure of Frank at this point.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and go to questions, and then we can come back to the applicant if they do arrive. Julie.
I feel like perhaps I'm being slow today, but I'm can somebody break this down a little bit more for me? If they're planning to redevelop this location, why are we designating it a historical site? I guess those two things are not meeting up in my mind.
Should I? Hi, so this is Lavelle again, and there's interest in preserving the warehouse building itself. So we're going to be looking at what aspects of the warehouse building are being preserved, how it's being preserved. We're going to be looking at the way that you relate any additions to the preservation of the warehouse. There are correlations that you can create between the existing warehouse building, that wonderful window configuration, creating setbacks that give still elevated interest to the warehouse itself, while there's other work being done on the rest of the site.
Kind of a follow-up, Jordan?
Go ahead.
So it looks like there's also 2 single-family homes on this site. Are those going to be torn down, and are people being displaced as a result of that?
those are adjacent to the warehouse and also owned by the property owners. And it's part of, whatever redevelopment and addition process that they are proposing would include, at least what I've seen at an early stage, would include removal of those houses.
And can we speak to the second part of that question? Are there people residing in those houses that are going to get displaced if they're torn down?
I am not sure of the status of residency of the houses.
I'd really like to get an answer to that if we can. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. I have a few folks in the queue here. So next is Gwen, followed by Amber.
Thanks. I don't know if you can share the pictures again of the building, but yeah, to follow up on what Julie was saying, my understanding is the building will be preserved and then there will be more construction adjacent. I guess I was curious, first of all, can they build on top of the building? Will they go up or on the actual building? And then also, if you pull those pictures up, there's the brick warehouse, but then there's kind of another section to the building. Is that part of the historical building, or is that an add-on later on that will not be part of this and not necessarily preserved?
Sure. Let me just bring up the presentation again.
There we go.
So the property owners, which is also the designers, they came to the HPC a couple times with ideas on how to add density and capacity around the warehouse, and while retaining the warehouse and telling the story of the warehouse. The proposal did include working with the addition, that 1950s addition behind it. And it did include adding above the warehouse, but setting it back significantly to really actually kind of highlight the elevator shaft that you see a little bit in some of these pictures here, and stepping back from that. And then, of course, around it with the adjacent lands.
Great. So that, to follow up, that lower section if we're looking at the upper right-hand corner picture, the section to the left that kind of has some white blobs of painting on it, that's going to stay and they're going to incorporate that then?
Yeah, that was planned to stay in place and to be cleaned up and added onto.
Okay.
Correct.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks. Next, Amber, and then John.
Yeah, thanks. And Lavelle, I'm sorry, I'm not super familiar with the historic preservation and how that all works. So I think my question is similar to what Julie's was. I would love to hear from the developer, kind of, if we're redeveloping it, why are we designating it? And maybe you can answer what a little more detail about what the benefits of having it designated would be for the developer, I guess. I don't really understand all that, and I apologize if I'm being redundant here.
Sure, and I do see that Mike Morgan has joined the meeting as an attendee. If you'd like to bring him over, and he could help to talk about what they see as the benefits. From a community perspective, as I mentioned early on, we find that the idea of pursuing adding our own local eligible buildings to an inventory is a way to be able to elevate things that we get to provide more context to and be more place related. So the idea of the local inventory is something we want to see grow, and we want to see it as a way to encourage the preservation of certain structures and reusing certain structures. So there's two incentives in our code right now. One is the parking reduction. And that is something that Mr. Morgan and his team are interested in pursuing through this process. There's preservation, there's restoration that you're talking about related to the warehouse itself that would be a benefit to the community and be able to tell more of the story of the warehouse and industrial life along that rail line. So in terms of, Amber, your other question about the property owners and designers' desires, could you restate your question and then maybe Mike could help answer that?
Yeah, hi, Mike. I'm guessing my question really is more like, since you're redeveloping this piece, I mean, is the benefit to you the parking reduction, or can you just talk about the development? We haven't heard anything from you yet, so I'd just like to hear a little more about.
So can I jump in for a minute and say, well, first of all, welcome, Mike. We just Lavelle went through the staff report, and we've been doing a few questions. I've got one more question for staff from John Contos, and then so I'm going to go to John, and then we'll come back to you, Mike, for to answer Amber's question, and then to go through any background that you'd like to provide us. So, John?
Yeah, thank you. I was just curious about the parking reduction. What does that really mean?
Lavelle, you want to take that?
There's a section in our code, in the parking code, that allows a parking reduction for landmark historic resources. And there's several different ways that gets used. And what it's intended to do is to help, again, with adaptively reusing existing historic buildings that just at the time had never really contemplated needing parking that we have in our modern days. So it's a regulation, it's a process that is handled administratively, and it allows you to, on balance, look at what is being proposed and what is being asked, and we do some comparison. There's no fixed formula on how much you can ask for as a reduction, but we work with the zoning officers to determine the appropriate amount, and so it would be based on, say, a difference between what a project is being proposed as and what they had historically and what might be asked for as a reduction. We've never really used it as a full removal of parking. It's really a on balance kind of request. And in this case, we'd be looking at it from how much is associated with the warehouse building, how much parking would they need, and how much is the applicant asking for, and we'd work out the specific requirements administratively.
Thanks.
Jordan, you're muted.
Thanks, talking to myself here. Mike, I'd like to turn it over to you, and you're welcome to provide any background information that you want as well on the project, as well as to answer Amber's question.
Okay, thank you. I think maybe I start with trying to use our time most wisely. Do I need to go in a little bit and tell the story about this a little bit here? Is that can I start with that and then try to answer questions so you get a better sense of what we're proposing? How can I best help you folks?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's helpful. Laval did go through some of the building history and the historic elements of it. And you're welcome to fill in anything else on the story and what you're proposing to do. We need to wrap up probably in about 10 to 15 minutes on this item. So.
Okay. And you haven't seen anything about concepts of proposed design work or anything like that, right? And I
No,
know
we have not.
Okay, and I don't think that's what this is about, but okay, so I'll leave that out for
I do think that would be helpful. I think I think that we did have a question before you joined about it could be at odds to designate a historic resource and redevelop a historic property. So I think if you can kind of talk about how those fit together and I think that would be really helpful for the committee.
Okay. Laval, do you have those from our application that you could help me with, so I'm not here fumbling around hitting buttons trying to talk and try to figure out how to pull up renderings, or do I need to do that?
Laval, are you able to?
Yeah, hello. I have the presentation up that shows the existing building, and I can just look at folder. It'll take me a minute, but I think, Mike, if you could just speak to how you see the reuse and the design benefit around the warehouse itself, that would be great. And I'll put the original drawings.
Okay, that sounds good. Thank you. So, so the warehouse, Bissinger Warehouse, that is such a significant part of everything that we think about this property. I'm so excited to have the ability to have something that's historic, that has a history and a story to tell, and needs to be maintained and preserved. And everything we're designing for this property puts that building first. And no matter how all this comes out, that's our objective. So how we want to utilize that is this site is ideal for, and zoning states so, this site is ideal for a mixed use of on the site. It's an M1R zone, so there's existing on the site 2 warehouses now that are going to be continued to be used as either a manufacturing type of use or office use or retail or a restaurant or brewery or distillery, whatever that. We're not trying to say exactly what use will be in those spaces because we don't know what's going to be in there yet. It's open to what a tenant most is suitable for that space. So we're trying to leave it flexible to who's going to go in there for the lifespan of the project. Then what we're adding to the project is residential multifamily units, more on a bit of on a higher end because the site, that's what it's calling for, is a nice units that go along and complement the historic buildings. And the location is so great, and it right on the trail. It's so close to downtown. I live within 2 blocks of this, and I use this area all the time. And it's such a great location. And the views, and I can't tell you how excited I am about it. But on site, we plan to have enough parking for all of the residential, based on how zoning describes what's required, and depending on what those uses are, even enough parking if it's like an office space or manufacturing type of use, we have adequate parking for that. If it's a use like a coffee shop or a bike shop that's retail that has a different parking count requirement, that's where we'd want the exception to allow that use to be able to be utilized on the site and have an exception on parking because they'd be occupying the historic buildings on the site. as Lavelle touched on, why that parking is allowed for something like that. So that's really a summary of it. We're really planning around the bike path and bicycles and pedestrian use coming and going from the site, heavily emphasizing that. We're using materials that complement the historic building, but the zoning and the adaptive reuse of this site calls for higher density than what a single story warehouse can accommodate. So we need to go up. And so that's our design solutions is having more than one story, of course, and on the rear of the site, away from the view from the streets, would be parking. So that's the idea. Is that a good introduction for everybody?
Yep, that's helpful. Thanks. So I've got some questions. I've got Gwen Jones, and then after Gwen is Julie.
Okay.
Couple of different questions. I was looking up the zoning, and it is zoned much more densely, but it is surrounded by basically other houses that are 1 or 2 story. So first question is, what is the maximum allowable height under this zoning, and do you have any thoughts on how high up you go?
Sure. The maximum allowable height is 50 feet in M1R zone. And we're not hitting that height anywhere. We don't need to, but in the center part of the site, we'd be getting close to that, about 45 feet. And then as we get to the west, which is where a single family residence is, we'd step that height down to be, I don't recall exactly what that height would be, but it would need to be lower, like 35 feet, I think we have somewhere in there, to try and help with that. And it's also not all along the entire property line. There's a small width of orientation to that side property line of building that's facing that property. Other than that, there's a fair amount of setback from the building, because at the back, that's where we have parking and a little bit of landscape buffering.
Thank you. And quick follow-up. Great. That helps. And I haven't looked up well, I think it's the adjacent. It's the same zoning. I appreciate the step down. I do think that's important in these residential sections. It just is better designed. So I appreciate that. My other just quick question is, if there's a historic designation for this property, to me, the value to the community and the adjacent neighborhood is, one, not only keeping and fixing up that historic building, but having some information accessible to the public through signage or whatever that explains the history of the building, that incorporates that information and that theme. And do you have any thoughts on how you would do that? Because I think that's really important, to not just save the building, but to tell a story.
Yes, I'll try to refrain from getting into too much, because there's a lot of consideration to that. And I get pretty excited about it. So if I get going too far, just cut me off. But the intention is a few things. There's in the design of the project, between the Bissinger warehouse facing south first, next to that right now is a garage type of a space that was added on later. Our plan would be to remove that, because it's covering up a good amount of the side of that warehouse that used to be at one time exterior wall. And inside of that garage, you see there still are windows and openings in there that could be presented again if that garage were to be removed. So we have a gallery entry vestibule area that's very transparent storefront, that allows you to see the entire depth of that whole run of that side of the building. But some of it is interior conditioned space. and some of it's still exterior exposed, about the same amount that's now. And inside of there, it's gallery, because that's where part of our presentation on the history would be, there'd be photographs and descriptions of the history of the project, some artifacts that we have from we've discovered in the building. And so that's one thing. And then outside, we're very excited to be able to say that Washington Corp is wanting to participate and bring in some relics that have to do with the railroad era, and they're offering to put a monument on that right-of-way area there to describe some history of that site also. So there's a couple of things, major things that we want to do to describe the history, as well as just maintaining what's inside of the building and not changing that visibly at all. There's a little detail of the freight elevator in there. It still operates. It's really great in that era to have a freight elevator, an electric freight elevator. So that's going to stay and continue to operate and be presented like it's kind of like the operation of the building originally was. It still would be, but with just a new use inside.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Julie.
I'd like to restate my earlier question, since we have Mike here now, and that's that there's two what appear to be single-family homes on the site, and I'm curious if they are currently occupied, and what is the plan for those residents if they are?
Sure. One of them is not occupiable. It's in condemned condition. They've both lived out their life beyond their lifespan. The centermost house is occupied by a tenant that's renting the place, but we keep having, it's a temporary thing, and the occupancy tends to be fairly short-lived, and then they move on. It's just, they're just not salvageable. They're heavily beyond their lifespan. There's not anything of historic character like over on 4th Street, those brick buildings, for example, that we all know about on that development. It's not that kind of character. They're just not worth saving, and it wouldn't, to try to save them there's just too much to put into them. So they're really, their lifespan's over. They need to be just demolition.
Okay, Jordan, can I have it's not really a follow-up, it's a unrelated question.
Go ahead.
In the presentation that Laval gave us, it indicated that one of the uses for the warehouse building was tanning. And I'm wondering if they actually did tan hides there, or if it was just a warehouse, because, and if they did do tanning there, if there's been environmental assessment done, because that can often involve some pretty caustic chemicals.
Sure, good question. My best understanding is that this was and I did a lot of research on the operations of Bissinger Corporation, this was a staging point. Their main operation was in Troutdale, Oregon. They had a huge site there with a massive building, and that's where the actual tanning and working with the carcasses occurred. This was a staging point on the rail where people would bring their trappings to the building and sell to the company, and they also offered sales of product, but not that I'm aware of, did they actually process there. I think that in the basement, I'm gathering this just on my own, trying to put pieces together, that it looks like they would have removed hides from carcasses there. but they couldn't have done very much of it because there's nowhere to dispose of the waste that produces. So it had to be limited. So there's a loading dock, of course, on the rail there. And so the train would come, they'd load the product on, and it would go on to Troutdale. And their home office was in San Francisco. They had several other locations, but their main plant operation was in Troutdale, Oregon.
Thanks.
Great, thanks. Okay, I think we're pretty much out of time. This is a pre-public hearing item, so there's no action today. Would anyone...
Jordan, I'm sorry.
Yes. Well,
This was supposed to be an action in committee and not a public hearing, as this resolution, as direction I was given from Marty. So the referral does state that this is an action item and that it was supposed to be a vote on that resolution to approve.
great, thanks for clarifying that. I misread that. So, okay, so we will need a motion. So would anyone like to make the motion? I have, it looks like Amber.
Yeah, I'd be happy to make the motion.
Okay, so on that note then, is there any?
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry,
Point
Julie?
of order, our agenda does not say that this is a voting item. The agenda says that this is informational only.
Yeah, you're right. The referral says that it's not information, or that it's action item, but so it may be inappropriate since the agenda was advertised that way. Council President Brian, can you weigh in on that?
I was worried you were going to ask me. I'm uncertain. I was going to note the same thing that Julie noted, the agenda versus the referral. If we have additional time in the committee, it might be worth getting a quick recommendation from city attorney.
Yeah, Mr.
And
Nugent.
then, come back for action on this or not act on it.
Yeah.
The safest course would be to hold it over.
Yeah. Jim, can you advise?
Sure, I think you have plenty of time to correct the agenda before the Monday night meeting. I'm not sure what happened with respect to getting it on the agenda, but I do know that Marty's going to be short-staffed here real shortly because Kirsten's moving to Aaron's office. Mm-hmm. But you still have well in advance of 48 hours to do the correction and have it advertised for the resolution, as I understand it. Is that what Lavelle is expecting?
Yes.
This is Lavelle, if I may. Sorry, Jordan.
Yep, go ahead.
The original intent here was as a resolution that that you were able to vote on it in committee, and then the result of that vote would go to the council floor as either a consent agenda or committee report, that it didn't require a hearing. And I did notice last night that the item on the agenda wasn't labeled as a motion, so I sent out an email to some folks saying, what do we do? And that is where the referral said it was supposed to be an action item and a motion in committee. But I noticed also that the agenda hadn't stated it that way. So if you prefer to hold it over till next week, that's a possibility. We've had this debate, this deeper discussion here in committee, and didn't know if it needed to actually be a public hearing.
So I think if time is not of the essence, I think that might be ideal. If we do need to move this forward in order to keep things on track, I'd suggest we could submit it as an item of new business. Jim, do you have a thought on either of those approaches?
Well, I think you have the flexibility to do what you need to do, but I think you could easily move it forward and not be violating any of the public participation laws, because the primary purpose is to ensure public participation. But if you'd rather hold off, you can hold off without jeopardizing anything from my perspective.
Okay. Well, I think since the referral clearly states the time frame, and since we do have well in excess of the 48 hours needed to get something on the agenda, I'm comfortable moving forward unless there's objection, and we can get the agenda corrected and make sure that this is on committee reports on Monday, so that there's an additional time to highlight it. Julie, does that meet your expectations on this?
Yeah, I think having it on committee reports on Monday night sounds like a good plan.
Okay. Brian, you have your hand up. Anything else?
I was just going to also suggest committee reports. I think is a perfectly appropriate slot in the agenda.
Okay. All right. It is the ruling of the chair that the motion is in order and we can vote on it. And I'll note for the record that there's well, I'm sorry. Well, is there any public comment? Seeing none, we can go ahead and move to a vote. Amanda, can you call a roll call vote, please?
Anderson. I think she's absent now.
Oh, I'm sorry. She did take off.
Becerra,
Yes.
Contos,
Yes.
Hess,
Yes.
Jones,
Yes.
Merritt,
No.
Ramos,
Yes.
Cheryl,
Yes.
Von Lossberg,
Yes.
and West.
Yes.
Okay. So the motion passes and that'll go under our committee reports.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Okay, we'll move on to our final agenda item, and this is.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Mike. This is an amendment to Article 3, Section 080.7, Parks and Open Space Requirements, Cash in Lieu, clarifying methodologies for determination of value. Grant Carlton is here for our staff report. We have Neil Miner and Donna Gockler here as well. And I want to preface this by saying that this came before LUP as an informational item in early February, I believe. And the intent here was to correct some issues with the appraisal process for our cash in lieu of parkland. This did go before planning board last week, and planning board had a robust discussion around the proposed changes. And this did come out of planning board with a recommendation to not a do not pass recommendation on a 5-4 vote. So a lot of good discussion, and I know that Grant will get into the planning board discussion. I think that that staff have some proposals, or some. I think that staff will address some of the planning board concerns, and we can go from there. So we did have a great presentation on this on Monday. So I'll turn it over to Grant and Donna and Neil for any introductory materials, and then we can jump into discussion.
Thanks, Jordan. Yeah, so I realized that the last agenda item ran a bit long. For the record, Grant Carlton, Open Space Program Manager, Parks and Recreation. So I will not rehash anything we discussed that I presented on Monday. I'm certainly glad to expound upon any of that information, take questions and comments. But I did want to allow you guys ample time to deliberate, ask questions, gather public comment. There are a few things. I've got about 4 or 5 slides I wanted to run through that were not necessarily included in Monday's presentation. Some of that or addressing comments and questions I've gotten since Monday. And just one other thing, I first wanted to highlight that this is something I wanted to mention on Monday, and just in the interest of time, didn't get into, but I think it's worth noting for you guys and for the public, that we're at the city, we're currently undergoing a workflow planning process, we're calling it, to address recommendations from a report we received from consultants in conjunction with city staff, called the city's recommendation report for subdivision and TED regulations. So that was sort of a hard look at our current sort of subdivision regulation regime, as well as the TED regulations. So there were certain recommendations that came out of that report that we're looking at. The timeline for completion is unknown at this time. But we do anticipate exploring more systematic changes to the cash in lieu and parkland dedication system, as well as just the broader subdivision regulation regime. And so this amendment is meant to be sort of surgical in nature, and is intended to address these issues that I mentioned on Monday in the near term. So again, we're going to look at more systematic changes. I don't know what those will look like, or if there will be any at all, but we are bound by state law. And so working within the bounds of state law, we will, again, try to address more systematic issues as we move forward with that process. One of the primary questions, concerns we've gotten is, and what I would call the primary sort of material change with this proposal is that, of course, the change from the subdivider hiring the appraiser to the city now hiring the appraiser as part of this proposal. So I wanted to quickly just provide some background and some rationale for that. As I mentioned on Monday, and we're all familiar with the cash in lieu requirements, along with the park land dedication regs in the subdivision regulations, are intended to manifest public amenities and assets. And these assets and amenities, these open space opportunities, have been identified and prioritized in our plans that I mentioned, specifically the Master Parks and Rec Plan, the Open Space Plan, Long Range Transportation Plan, Growth Policy, and these are, community adopted objectives. And so the specific purposes for these regulations are actually, delineated in the subdivision regulations themselves. I went over that on Monday. We can dig back into that if you guys have questions. And these amenities also, it's worth noting, will ultimately serve the residents of the subdivision. So again, these funds that we are collecting are not going into the general coffers of the city. These will be invested directly in the vicinity of these subdivisions. So we're serving the public, and we're serving these new residents and homeowners. And so, we're talking about livability standards, and our park portfolio, I think is certainly one of the primary components that makes Missoula Missoula. So that being said, transparency is something that has been a theme of this proposal from the onset. And I would argue, specifically in the appraiser selection process, transparency is lacking under the current regulation. We've got two private entities contracting with one another. So we've got a private subdivider contracting with a private appraiser, and obviously there's no transparency or sort of public visibility in that process. So again, we're trying to carry out public objectives in the public interest, also serve these subdivision residents. And we don't have, this is not, the distinction I would draw is this is, we've got setback requirements and utilities and things like that. Those are sort of negative requirements. This is something that is supposed to manifest funding for public entities, or in the public interest, as well as serving the subdivision. And so it stands to reason that we would have some transparency in that process. And so again, the city selecting the appraiser, and I'll go into the details of that in just a moment, as I did on Monday, but that builds in transparency, which in turn leads to, I would argue, efficiency, consistency, and again, accountability. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention yet again that this is certainly not meant to convey any sort of mistrust towards towards the development community or the appraisal community. Quite the contrary, at the city we certainly respect those two communities, and those folks have exhibited nothing but the utmost integrity and professionalism. So it's not geared towards that at all. I wanted to highlight that one more time. I presented some appraiser procurement procedural highlights on Monday evening. This is a slide that I've added to this a little bit based on some feedback I've gotten since then. Again, we will go through the standard city RFQ process to develop this pool of community appraisers. We will invite all appraisers in the community to submit their qualifications. We will develop objective criteria for selecting those. So again, this is not a new process. The city goes through the RFP process consistently and regularly. And we will invite the development community to help us develop that criteria. So there will be development community and public input in development of that RFQ, which will in turn select these appraisers. Once again, we will refresh that RFQ procurement process every 3 to 5 years to ensure fairness in appraiser selection. We will have limitations on the length of those professional contracts, again, to ensure fairness in selection. We will delineate a fee structure to ensure that fees are appropriate and consistent. This, avoids excessive fees, which will, the idea there is that these excessive fees will not be passed on to future buyers. With an eye towards hopefully keeping these projects as affordable as possible. Again, we will engage with a pool of selected appraisers, which will be dependent upon the number of appraiser applicants that we receive. And then one thing I didn't mention, and again, this RFQ is an administrative process. We do have some things to iron out, but again, this is not new territory for the city. This is part of that administrative process regularly. And so one other thing is timing of commissioning those appraisals. We've gotten some questions related to, is the city hiring the appraiser? Is this going to extend the timeline? We will address that. We'll address the fees and the timing of that to ensure that we do not create a more lengthy timeline specifically. One of the other sort of changes that we went over that is part of the proposal is some wording, some wordsmithing clarification. So I didn't explicitly highlight this on Monday, and I wanted to. So the zoning designation as it relates to fair market value. So no material change is proposed as part of this amendment with respect to the zoning designation. Our current language contemplates that the zoning designation at the time of final plat will apply to the appraisal. That isn't changing. It's a simple clarification in wordsmithing. There was some confusing language. So again, we're still requiring that the zoning designation at the time of final plat will apply for the demonstration of fair market value. So again, that's been the intent all along. That is consistent with other communities. And of course, under state law, we will be, the requirement is that we will take the value of the unsubdivided, unimproved land. So again, we're in accordance with state law there. And again, no material change is contemplated. And lastly, on Monday's presentation, I did talk about planning board deliberation. I'm glad to go back into that in more detail if you guys have questions. But one of the discussion items at planning board was this specifically related to subsection B of the proposal, is the addition of an arm's length qualifier. So I have some proposed language here, like I mentioned, I would have if it will be helpful and if it is council's recommendation to move forward with this qualifier. So in the interest of time, that's all I have. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Grant. I've got some questions here. I'll start with Heather.
Thanks, Jordan. So, I really appreciate this RFQ process. I think it really can help get to a more desirable outcome. But I'm kind of curious with a couple of questions. Do we have just a ballpark of what an appraisal costs that the developer is going to be assuming the cost of?
Sure. Based on my experience, anywhere from $2,000 to $5,000 is probably a safe range. And again, I want to note that our current process dictates that an appraiser will be responsible for the fees. So the thing that we can address is making it to where the fees that we will be incurring will be consistent. So we could put a cap on those fees to make that a standard process. So again, no new fees for the developer. It's just a bit of administrative process to sort of put a ceiling on those caps and make it consistent.
Fair enough. Okay. So, it seems to me, Grant, that, this whole thing is coming about because there's a difference of opinion about what the value of that parkland is, correct?
I would frame it differently in that I would say that we're just experiencing issues related to inconsistent valuation, not questions related to what is parkland worth, but I think the sort of the catalyst for this conversation is rapidly increasing land prices. It's tough to keep up. The appraisal game, again, it's largely an art rather than a science. And so I don't think there's a question as to what parkland is worth. It's really what is the underlying, undivided, unimproved property worth. And does the system allow us to provide, our charge in our community and further our community adopted objectives? Does that answer your question?
Yeah,
It's in the method.
Sorry, what was that?
I think that there's a question, or the challenges are really in the methodology and how those fit in the subdivision regulations currently.
Okay. So just an experience that Habitat for Humanity experienced a couple of years ago, we built 2 homes that were virtually identical, and they both had to go through an appraisal process, and 2 different appraisers valued them very differently, like $30,000 different on a home that costs $150,000. So it was a very large chunk. And we couldn't do anything about that. And that affects the affordability to at least one of those property owners. And I'm just kind of curious that if a developer had a real beef or difference of opinion, can they opt to have a second appraisal pulled and then maybe take an average of those values so that it would be something that would be more reasonable than being caught having to pay something that is maybe overinflated by one person's opinion?
Sure. So the short answer is not under this proposal. First, I think, as I mentioned on Monday, the notion of challenging appraisals doesn't exist in our current language. So the city, as it stands, with the subdivider hiring the appraiser, does not have the avenue of challenging that or the ability to do so. And so this new language essentially changes the person or the entity that hires the appraisal. It is not part of the proposal that the subdivider would explicitly have the right to commission a new appraisal, but there's always the avenue of bringing it, before council, digging into the details of the appraisal if council so chooses. So that's always the avenue for challenging that. I also think, as I mentioned on Monday, we really want to avoid scenarios in which one professional community is challenging another. I think that creates lots of sort of relationship issues. These pools in our community are very small, and also it really creates efficiency issues and timing issues. When we're commissioning new appraisals, there's additional cost. It's again, appraisals are an art rather than a science. To put it simply, and that is where we're trying to build transparency. So we're selecting this pool via objective criteria, so that hopefully we have a pool of the most qualified appraisers for these particular projects, so that we don't have the need to necessarily challenge these. We're all sort of on the same page in developing the criteria with which we select the appraisers, and we then, as the city, we're sort of the client, if you're using appraisal jargon. Between the relationships between the city and the appraiser in this instance, we're able to, based on our experience with the market, we're able to communicate our expectations related to market data. We're not dictating what data those appraisers use, but if you guys recall, I pulled up an example that from Kalispell, I believe, Billings, and they actually, when they right in their subdivision regulations, they have sideboards on the comparable sales that can be used in a market analysis to demonstrate fair market value. So we will be communicating with appraisers to sort of set forth our requirements related to some of that data, which is something that we're not able to do now. So again, this is all with an eye towards creating consistency. And like you mentioned, there's vastly different appraisals, and we've experienced that at the city recently.
Thank you.
Thanks. Several hands up. Nick, I see your hand. I'm going to do some council comments and then I'll circle back around for some public comment. So I'm going to go to Julie and then Amber.
What you just said, Grant, reminded me of what my question was on Monday night. So you mentioned that if someone doesn't agree with an appraisal, that they can bring it before council. Can you give us a thumbnail of how that would work and where that could happen in the process? Because with the last couple of subdivisions that have come before us, they haven't even, like, we didn't even know how much parkland was going to be dedicated when we voted on it. So I guess I don't understand how that would happen in the order of operations.
Admittedly, I'm not well steeped in how that process works. I understand that, right in the subdivision regulations, we're calling for the appraisal to be ultimately submitted to council. I mean, that's called out in the regulations themselves. So at what point that happens, I imagine it would be at the time of final plat submission. Perhaps Neil might be able to speak to that a little bit better than me.
Yeah, go ahead, Neil.
Neil Miner, the Parks and Trails Design Development Manager with Missoula Parks and Recreation. Currently in the subdivision regulations, once we receive the appraisal, we provide it to City Council for calculating the cash in lieu donation prior to final plat approval. I just read that straight from subdivision regulation. We have had a challenge in the past in the past year with appraisals coming back. We've had 3 ranging from $2.07 to $3.17 to $12.10 per square foot. There is not a way for us to ask questions or to challenge that based on our language. And I believe that that's what we're trying to work in, is that transparency, like Grant mentioned. So I feel that our City Council's process to possibly look at those, or for the developer to change that, would be once we receive the appraisal, and if they had a challenge, we could actually work on getting another appraisal or appraisal review. All those were discussed as part of this process, but we ultimately landed on this.
Thanks. Jim, do you want to weigh in on that?
Yes, I just wanted to observe that whatever the process is, ultimately these decisions are made by the council. They have to be made well in advance of the final plat approval, because under state law, under the subdivision law, the function of the governing body at final plat is to see if the conditions have been complied with. At final plat, you don't get to add new conditions. You are merely checking to see if the conditions from preliminary plat approval have been complied with.
Okay, thanks. Amber and then Heidi.
Yeah, thanks. And I guess I want to start by pointing out that I recognize that appraisals are not chemistry, but I also, there are best practices around appraisals, and there's discretion within it, but it's also not kind of pulling something out of a hat. So I feel like that's important to recognize. My question, I think, for you, Grant, though, is I had asked around the RFQs, the review of the RFQs, and maybe I missed this. I have to admit, my dog threw up on the carpet in the middle of this. That's the beauty of being at home. Can't wait to be back in council chambers. But, I feel like as there were some questions around how often we would revise and review our RFQ and our procedures around that. Could you speak to that and how we could make some, I guess, guarantee around how we would do that?
Yeah, I do think we have a lot of sort of administrative flexibility there. And what I mean is, I in my presentation, I proposed, every 3 to 5 years we revisit and renew and sort of, resubmit the RFQ. to ensure fairness in selection of the appraisers. I mean, I don't think we have a limit, but on the shorter side of that term, 3 years, I mean, again, we have flexibility. We can move that range down if that makes more sense, every 1 year, every 2 years. I think that, again, the flexibility is there, and fairness is the objective. So I think that whatever makes sense administratively for us to do, we certainly don't want to create an administrative burden, but we will have professional services contracts with these appraisers. And if something that occurs that is not, I don't foresee this happening, but if the city will have avenues to terminate those contracts should there be some kind of default in the contract, or if something is not above board. So at the same time, there's that backstop as well. But again, I think what we're proposing is terms on the contracts themselves, and then a refreshed, renewed RFQ process to ensure fairness.
Thank you. Jordan, may I have a follow-up comment, or would you like me to hold that?
No, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. I just wanted to say that, one thing that I've found sitting on council for the last, almost year and a half is when these type of things have come to us, it has felt really inconsistent. And it's just been a very confusing and hard decision to make for me. And I appreciate that I have a lot of faith in our Parks Department and in the development community and all these things. So that has helped. But I like the fact that there would be more consistency in the valuation, that we're being more specific about the methodology. So, as generally, I think I'm happy to have more guidance and consistency here.
Thanks, Amber. Heidi and then Gwen.
Thanks. So I just briefly had some comments. I've mostly run into appraisals, of course, in the world of either purchasing my own house or working with community land trusts. And as you can imagine, there are some barriers to getting accurate appraisals in that realm as well. And my comments are that it seems fairly similar actually to the sort of process that a homeowner goes through when they're buying, securing a home loan. In that case, I'm paying for the appraisal, but the lending institution puts, a request for, an appraisal out there, and it goes kind of into a black box, and then an appraiser is picked from that pool of eligible appraisers. They do the appraiser, it comes back to the homeowner. And then there's also, of course, room to, contest what that result is if they, for example, didn't use adequate comps in reaching their conclusion. And so I think this is a process that actually is fairly similar to processes that are already accepted in the industry. And I don't think it's a far, diversion from that. And I think having really clear expectations around process, it can only be to the benefit to everyone doing the work, whether it's the private developer, the people doing the appraisals, or the city. And so I think that going through that RFQ process and really setting up expectations that are understood by all parties is really beneficial to the process. So that's all.
Thanks, Heidi. Gwen and then Brian.
Hey, thanks. I don't have a question. I have a comment, but it sounds like we can do a comment now. And I'm going to be gone Monday night when this is revisited by council. So I wanted to just share my thoughts now. And first, I think there are differences in appraisers' approach, but they're within sideboards set up by best practices. And I think that's acknowledging that there can be discretion applied is important. That's kind of what this whole conversation is about. But I wanted to back it up a second and just comment on the fact that appraisals are used in many different ways. There can be private transactions, and so the parties to the appraisal, the parties who are contracting to have an appraisal are are two private entities, or more often than not, people are getting an appraisal because they're buying property and need a mortgage, and the appraisal is part of the analysis to support the mortgage. But this situation where we're doing parkland appraisal for cash in lieu is a really different scenario, where there is a private entity on one side, and then on the other side is the city of Missoula really representing the citizens of this city. And I think we have a fiduciary obligation as that representative. So it is a very different dynamic, which raises up the level of importance in having transparency and a process so that there is a solid appraisal, because this is a very different dynamic than if it's just private parties or for a land transaction, or if it's a private party getting a mortgage. This is a completely different scenario. So all the more reason to have the RFQ process, have that transparency, and have the best interests of the city representing 80,000 people elevated. So I think you're going down the right path here, Grant. That's what I'm trying to say. It's difficult. These are super difficult things to work through, but I just wanted to put that out there as my thought process, that I think it's a good thing.
Thank you, Gwen. I've got Brian next, and then Mirta.
Yeah, I'll be pretty quick. So Heidi's comments resonated with me, and I listening to Gwen's comments, I'm not sure that the two thoughts are incompatible. I mean, what Heidi said that resonated with me is that there's a model for this kind of transaction out there, and we should, and it seems analogous enough. Granted, there are heightened levels of transparency required, but I'm not sure that it doesn't follow that analogous model that Heidi described in a transaction. Quickly, I will just say, if a backstop, and maybe I'm not tracking it correctly, is the thought that, council's going to decide among competing appraisal values or something, I don't look forward to that. I don't think that's a process that we're well positioned to be in the middle of. So, and then I have one last thing. I'll just cue it up here, but I'll come back to it later with the chair's permission. Relative to planning board and how this works out again. I will simply say at this point that, there's several entities that need to use this tool. Planning board needs to use this tool. We need to use this tool. Staff needs to use this tool, the tool being the process. And I'm uncomfortable with the 5-4, do not pass recommendation from planning board, and whether or not it's contemplated that they would see it again, and just thoughts around that process issue.
Yeah, that's a great question. Let's put a pin in that and come back to that. Oh, Donna, you have your hand up. Do you want to address that?
I would. Thank you. Donna Gockler, Director of Parks and Recreation. I think ultimately what we are trying to do is get away from the idea that council's faced with having to settle challenges on the council floor. We believe that by working with the development community, with CPDI, we can come up with a good criteria, a good request for qualifications, select the most qualified people, come up with a process that's consistent and transparent, and do what both Heidi and Gwen describe. And as most of you referred, Amber's absolutely correct. These people are, they're certified, they're licensed, they're trained, and their very job relies on it, just like any other profession. As far as planning board goes, we did talk about this with some of the CPDI staff, and we completely respect and honor all of the comments we received from planning board. I think that Grant really focused his presentation and any recommended edits based on planning board comments. The reason I am comfortable with a 5-4 vote is the dissension was very polarized. If you will, being too good to developers, being too hard on developers. And it was so polarized that we felt like we really are somewhere in the middle, which is where we often find ourselves in trying to represent the public and trying to promote good development.
Thank you, Donna. I have Mirta next, and then Jesse, and then we'll go to public comment, and then take on next steps from there. Mirta?
Thank you, Jordan, and thanks, Donna, for that. I'm gonna point out the obvious here, but a cash in lieu of parkland dedication is not a given. This is a determination that is made by our city staff on behalf of our community, holding the interest of our community when making that decision. So that transaction, because that's what it is, in my opinion, requires 3 essential components, and that is consistency, transparency, and fairness. And those are components that I think our community expects and deserves. And I think that if we can work to create a process where that is explicitly presented to the community and aligns with the best interests of the community and with the decisions made to accept that cash in lieu of dedication, of parkland dedication, then we should do whatever we can to provide that process and that platform. And so I support what staff is recommending. I know that planning board had a hard time deciding on it. But I think that, like I said, this is not a given. It's a determination that's being made on behalf of our community. So thanks.
Great. Next, I have Jesse.
Thank you, Chairman Hess. What Donna said really resonated with me. I mean, I see scenarios where this could raise the cost for the developer, but I also see scenarios where the intent is fulfilled in this. I do have one question. I'm pretty torn on it, but I have one question under Section 3 of the amendment on where it's outlined by the staff report on Section 3, number 2. And I apologize if this has been brought up. My internet's been horrible all day, but so if a property that is undergoing subdivision review has been purchased within 1 year of the date of the final plat or of the final plat application submittal, the sale price of the property evidenced by an executed contract can be used to demonstrate fair market value. My question is, since subdivision often takes more than a year, 18 plus months, is there any way that staff would be amenable to this, or council would be amenable to extending that out? Maybe to 2 years, or maybe even 3 years, just because of that time that it takes. Once the developer purchases it, develops his business model, develops the sale of the home, if you guys would be amenable to changing that date, that time constraint for that use of the appraisal when they purchase the home.
Do you guys have comments on that, or do you want me to sort of take a shot at answering that?
Let's go ahead. Let's get a staff perspective first. And
yeah, I think that I have heard that concern, and I certainly understand that these these projects can take several years to develop sometimes. I'll let Donna speak to it, but my personal take is, just because I have heard this from a range of folks, I personally would be open to some flexibility there. I think we're getting into a bit of dangerous territory when we're talking, past 18 months or 2-3 years, because the market can change so rapidly. So that's sort of my take on it.
Or what about just the time that it takes to go through subdivision review or something like that? For the approval within subdivision review, whatever time that is. Because then it kind of puts it more on the city too, and it's really out of the developer's control.
Sure.
So Donna, looks like you have your hand up, and then we do have some development community representatives here, so I'll go to them next. Donna?
I was just going to say that has not been a recommended change from past practice, and we have not experienced that concern expressed a lot. That said, I think that the city has always done our best to be gracious about, especially if we're part of the problem of delaying the process. But otherwise, I think there should be some evidence on why the process is delayed, as opposed to what I've also experienced is a time of recession. The subdivision process just gets delayed for all kinds of reasons for a good amount of time.
Thanks, Donna. So before we go to the public comment, we were scheduled to wrap up at 11:15. Ms. Anderson has graciously ceded some time from Public Safety and Health, so I'm going to keep us going for a few more minutes here. Dave or Nick, feel free to weigh in.
I'm on Nick's Zoom here, so I'll let him start.
Okay, Nick.
Thanks, Jordan. I really appreciate it. Can you all hear me? All right.
Yep.
Okay. So, I listened to everybody and Donna and Grant and Neil, and I really appreciate that. We all appreciate what Parks and Recreation does for our community. And a lot of what I heard is that we want to cooperate, we want to work with each other to try to get this done. And we sent some comments to Grant late at the end of the business day yesterday. He did a good job in addressing some of those, but I want to share with you that there's a lot of frustration out in the development community right now. And that frustration needs to be addressed. And the best way to address it is by teamwork and working together. So I want to give you an example of what happened last Thursday. So we had a meeting with Jeremy Keene and Aaron Pehan and Dale Bickle with the new Community Planning, Development, Innovation Division to talk about frustrations relative to the process and delays in the process. And over the past year, they listened to our concerns. They identified the root issues. They developed a strategy to address the issues. They developed a funding mechanism to implement the strategy, which is increased review fees. And then they brought the plan to the development community for discussion. And the outcome of that was, and this is a quote from Wade Hoyt to Aaron Pehan in an email last week, says, "As I said this morning, your review of changes being implemented was welcomed by all of us and encouraging that we can work together. You are right. We may not always agree, but a discussion is always welcome. If you need something from us for City Council, let me know." And so I take that wonderful experience, right, of working with the city and having the city listen and include the development community, and I look at this process, and I think Grant has listened really well. But I think that what the city's asking to do here really has the potential to increase the park dedication requirement. And I think the whole process would really benefit to stop and take a breath. Invite the people you haven't heard from, which are the appraisers, which you've talked a lot about today. Invite the development communities with conversation with Parks and Recreation so we can work through the things that Grant is working through today, based on the comments that we provided last night. I think that moving this to council for a decision Monday night would be premature. I think you'd leave a lot of frustration out there in the development community. And if you take a moment and just go back and look at the success and the process that was just used with the new Community Planning and Development and Innovation entity, that will come out with a much better outcome. Now, I could go into some details regarding the proposal itself, but I think that's my primary message this morning. Let's work together. In order to do that, let's have a meeting. There's never been a meeting with the appraisers of the development community on this. Brian's comment that he's a little bit hesitant regarding the planning board vote. Well, let's bring some planning board members to that meeting. Let's do a little transparency on this, and let's provide good conversation. And then the council will have good information and a good proposal to look at. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. Dave?
Yeah, I was part of that meeting too that Nick is referring to, and it was very refreshing. I think Erin's approach is excellent. She wants to bring people in. She wants to understand what is going on. And we've always said it shouldn't be us versus them. It should be, let's work together. Let's produce the best thing we can for Missoula. And so I'm not sure this part of the process even needs to be changed. As we've said all along today, appraisers are independent and they're certified. whoever is picked, and I mean, we didn't pick the appraiser for the last cash in lieu we did. I think the bank picked it. So it's not a case of us trying to pick an appraiser to get a certain value. I also agree with what Jesse was saying, that we need more time. And the last project we just did, we bought it in May of 18 and we started building in December of last year. It took 2 3/4 years to get going. And so we should be able to do that cash in lieu based on the price. There's no point paying for an appraisal. We had to pay for an appraisal. All the costs go into the final cost. So I think, as Nick said, if we all sat down and realistically talked about it, we could come up with a much simpler solution than we're talking about now. I understand where the city feels they have to have this whole process to be transparent and everything else, but independent appraisers will value the land, and whatever that number is what the developer pays. And I don't think it needs a massive process change that we're looking at. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Grant and Heather, both very briefly, please. We are over time, and I need to wrap us up here.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll be super brief. This isn't necessarily intended as a rebuttal to Mr. Coffin's statements. We're more than welcome of public comment, especially from the development community. I just, for the record, want to note that back on March 4th, I sent an email with this proposal and all the background and context to hundreds of folks, a broad swath of the development community, interested stakeholders, attorneys, organization of realtors, developers, engineers. So that was our initial attempt to reach out. Before that, we were at land use and planning to sort of lay out our plans and intentions. We were at planning board, and I will note throughout that entire process until basically last night, I didn't receive one single public comment other than a couple of phone calls for information on when the meetings were going to occur. So again, not necessarily a rebuttal. I just wanted to put that on the record.
Okay. Thank you, Grant. Heather.
Thanks, Jordan. And my comment was to back up Grant, saying that he did his part to notify the development community of this particular idea. However, it fell flat, and I think there's room for improvement there, that maybe we can try again. And now that it's brought to a higher level of comprehension in the development community about the importance of this, maybe we can have another conversation now that folks are more aware of what's going on. I would support potentially just holding this in committee for a little bit longer so that we could hear more from the development community.
Thanks, Heather. Nick, I'll let you go ahead and go again. We normally do once around, but I know that you're vested in this, so go ahead.
I appreciate very much Grant's comments and what we've learned through the pandemic, and what we've learned as we've grown in terms of public involvement, that doing things the old way, where you send out an email, right, and you get no responses. I sent out emails following grants to try to get responses, and I actually contacted people 3 times to get their responses, and I put those together in an email to Grant last night. I'm just saying that there's a better way to do things than the way we used to do them, and I think that the city is on the right track in the way they looked at review fees for subdivisions, the way they addressed the transportation impact fee for the Mullen Road transportation area, and I just think that this one would benefit by that same process and conversation. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Nick. Final comment goes to Jesse, and then we're going to adjourn this meeting. Go ahead, Jesse.
I guess I just had a quick question for you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So would it be appropriate to make my amendment now, or should we just wait and kind of see? This might be held in committee. I mean, I don't really know.
Well, so I was just about to address process, and it's a great question. So the public hearing is still open, and so we will conclude the public hearing on Monday, and then that would be an appropriate time to make a motion. It would also be an appropriate time to refer the item back to committee or take final action. So we have several paths forward, and I think Monday would be the appropriate time for any action or expression of intent to delay or anything else along those lines.
Okay, thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Okay, thanks everyone. Thanks to Stacy for the time out of the next meeting. And thanks everyone for your flexibility. We'll be adjourned, and we'll see you in a few minutes for public safety and health.